some pup. I felt something tickle my nose and I growled in annoyance, rolling away from it. Snuggling into my pillow. Geez, you still sleep like a baby. A voice mumbled and I ignored it. Wait a minute. I thought to myself. I'd know that voice from anywhere. My eyes snapped open and quickly sat up, seeing blonde locks of hair. Lily. I gasped, and Lily herself sat on the edge of the bed, holding a feather with a huge smile on her face. In the flesh, she said, gesturing to herself, and I lunged for her, making us both fall to the floor. What the hell are you doing here? I asked in disbelief as I held her to me tightly. Maybe if I could breathe. Lily trailed off, and I let go of her, still in shock, as we now sat on floor. It was quite interesting. I got a call from the Alpha Tate. I said in disbelief, and she nodded, continuing. Think of it as a late birthday present, she said with a smirk, and I grabbed her by the shoulders, crushing her into me again. Best birthday present ever, I said with a squeal, and Lily giggled. It felt good to see her. One can only go on for so long without their partner in crime. I have so much to tell you, I said, dragging out the word so, and Lily nodded her head in argument as she suddenly stood up, dusting herself off. I heard you haven't been into town yet, she asked, walking to my closet and throwing me a pair of jeans and a black top that was a size too small. Haven't had the chance to, it's been busy, I said, scratching the back of my head as I stood up and began to undress. You came to the official werewolf committee, and don't bother to go down to the mall down the road, she said, shaking her head in disbelief, and I looked at her with my eyebrow raised. Down the road? I asked, getting dressed as I picked up the comb on the bedside table and ran it through my hair a couple of times. Not literally, Lily said with an eye roll, and she sat on my bed looking at me with a dreamy smile. The Alpha, though, she trailed off, fanning herself, is quite a sight. My head snapped to hers and I growled lowly, not being able to control myself as I clenched my fist. Lily looked at me in shock, and I felt bad for growling at her, but the thought of someone thinking about Tate, my mate, in that way made me feel pure fury. Whoa, Lily said, holding her hands up in surrender. And I thought I was Satan's disciple. Why the growl? She asked, moving back slightly as she looked at my eyes that must have shifted a shade darker. I don't like you talking about my mate like that, I said, and I heard her gasp. Before I could register what was happening, I was knocked to the floor, and Lily laid on top of me with a big smile as she shook my shoulders. Your mate's with an alpha, she all but screamed as I shoved her off of me, laughing. Alina, you're telling me that piece of heaven? She paused, shaking her head in disbelief. Is your mate? She asked with wide eyes, and I rolled my eyes at her dramatic tone. Yes, Lily, I said in a dismissing tone as I walked out of the room with Lily trailing behind me. Yes, Lily, she repeated in outrage as she trailed behind me until I opened the door, stepping outside and stretching my joints. That's all, no details, no beautiful juicy details, she said in disbelief, and I turned around, giving her a smile as I grabbed her shoulders lightly. Geez, Lily, you need to ease of those energy drinks. I will tell you everything, I promise, I said, giving her my best smile, and she rolled her eyes, unsatisfied but agreed nevertheless, making my smile widening. As we begun walking further out of the building, I spotted Eddie playing with a toy truck, and I jogged over to him, crouching down to his eye level. Hey buddy, I said, ruffling his hair, and he glared at me, making me giggle. Hi Luna, he said, his playful glare vanishing as he smiled up at me, squinting slightly because of the sun. My friend over there, I said, pointing to Lily, and I are going to the mall. Could you tell your brother if you see him? I asked, and Eddie leaned back slightly to get a glimpse of Lily, and then he leaned back forward, looking at me. Is the mall safe? He asked, narrowing his little brown eyes at me, and I rolled my eyes. Only 8 and his already Tate number 2. Yes, Eddie, we're just gonna catch up and do girl stuff, I said purposely, and Eddie scrunched up his nose in distaste. All right, I'll tell him, he said, and I smiled brightly, pinching his cheeks. I flicked his nose and let little flecks of water come out of my fingertips, making Eddie giggle. That is so cool. I blew into my straw and watched amused as bubbles erupted in the plastic cup, making me giggle to myself as I waited for Lily to take in everything I just told her. Her mouth was hanging wide open, and I couldn't help but laugh as I grabbed her chin and shut it closed. Careful, might catch a fly or two, I said, chuckling to myself, but Lily just shook her head and her mouth opened in shock. Again, Principal Rufus, wow, who would have thought? She mumbled, leaning her head down to put her straw in her mouth as she slurped loudly on her smoothie. And holy shit, Lily suddenly said, making me jump back as she slapped her hands down on the table in the food court, gaining attention as people looked at us weirdly. Urine, she said, whispering harshly as she leaned in. An elemental, she said as she leaned back, slurping on her drink. I went to speak, but she frantically shook her head. I mean, you've been living the life of a movie character while I studied for exams. Lily said, shaking her head in disbelief as a smile broke loose on her face. That's my girl, she said with a squeal as she clapped her hands together in excitement. Can I speak now? I asked in amusement, and Lily nodded, her smile widening. I opened my mouth to speak, but someone cleared their throat and I groaned in annoyance, looking up. In front of us stood 3 boys about our age. They all had smug smiles and they looked at us smirking as they flexed their muscles. I glanced at Lily, who looked at the boys in amusement, and I turned back at them and raised an eyebrow. Is there a reason why you're standing there? I asked rudely, and the 3 guys looked slightly taken aback. The one in the middle, however, slid into the chair next to mine and snaked his arm around the back of my seat, and I looked at him with wide eyes. Feisty one, aren't ya? The guy said, and his dirty blonde hair fell to the side as he tilted his head slightly, his cocky smile in place. The other 2 guys inched closer to Lily, and she growled at them, making them grin, and they raised their hands up in fake surrender. Look, Lily said, we don't have time for your fail attempts at flirting. Do yourselves a favor and leave, she said, pointing to the doors that lead into another section of the mall. I think we'd rather sit here with you pretty ladies, said the blonde next to me, and I snorted. If this is how you pick up girls, your game is weak, I said, grabbing my plastic cup as I drank through the straw, making a loud slurp sound. My game is not weak, he said, glaring at me. I can get girls any day and any night, he said, smirking, looking proud of his witty comeback, and me and Lily glanced at each other as we snorted, and she mumbled a yeah right under her breath. You don't want to mess with her. Her mate will eat you alive, Lily said with a grin, and the 2 boys closest to her looked at the blonde next to me in worry. Who is he? The blonde asked with a smirk. Some pup, he said, and then burst out laughing with his friends. I looked at him in annoyance, and the urge to punch him was strong. I went to push him out of the seat, but suddenly a shadow loomed over the table. No, said a low voice, making us all freeze. Not some pup, but your alpha. All 3 boys froze and turned to look at the figure behind me, their bodies frozen. Lily looked behind my head with a smirk, and I didn't dare move as I watched all 3 boys gulp in fear. Mark A. Alpha, the blonde next to me stuttered with wide eyes, as he glanced at me and back at Tate, who I knew was now standing behind me. I slowly turned around to be greeted by dark jeans. My gaze slowly traveled up a white tee, and my gaze fell on Tate's insanely attractive face. His eyes weren't on mine, however. His glare was fixated onto the boy next to me, and I saw the way Tate's eyes darkened by each passing second. Oh no, Alpha, Tate sneered. What happened to some pup? Tate said, tilting his head slightly as a grin graced his lips. It was anything but friendly. The look in his eye was murderous, and I couldn't help but shrink back in my seat. This side of Tate was scary, and shooting Lily a look, I noticed she was looking at Tate impressed. Some pup, the blonde echoed as he looked at his friends, letting out a nervous laugh. Who said anything about pups? The blonde said nervously as he scratched the back of his neck and placed his arm back around the back of my seat. Alpha, said the one closest to Lily as he bowed his head slightly. He looked up and glanced around the food court as numerous eyes watched us in confusion and in shock as they spotted the Alpha. We didn't mean any harm, he said, breathing fast as beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. Let this be a warning, and we promise never to upset you again, he said in desperation, and Tate let out a sigh, but his gaze immediately hardened. Maybe if your friend Tate seethed. His eyes narrowed into slits. Gets his arm away from my mate before I break it off. I'll consider it. The blonde next to me quickly snatched his hand back and shot out of his seat, and I couldn't help but let an amused grin slip onto my face. No matter how bad I felt, let this be a warning. Next time I'll have your head. Tate said in a growl, and the boys looked at him in horror and quickly nodded their heads and all but ran when Tate dismissed them. Looking over at Tate. His eyes were still a few shades darker than usual and his fists were clenched, and I rolled my eyes at how dramatic it was. "Lily, is it alright if we call it a day?" I said, looking at Lily as I nodded my head towards Tate, which she nodded in understanding to. "It's fine. I've got to head back anyway," she said with a smile, standing up as I did too, and she gave me a tight hug. "You better keep him on a leash," she whispered in my ear as she pulled back, and I snorted at her. "Yeah, right," I said, amused as I glanced at Tate, who patiently waited for me. "Don't miss me too much. I'll see when I can come around again," Lily said happily as she gave me a big smile. She glanced at Tate and her gaze stayed on him for a little longer than I would have liked, which made me tilt my head into her line of vision. "Yeah, see you soon," I said with a less happy smile as she turned around and left. Sighing, I spun around to tell Tate we could leave, but I bumped into his chest as he appeared right behind me. "Ready to go," he breathed into my ear, and I shivered involuntarily. I said back, sounding breathless, making Tate's lips pull back into a smirk. Gently grabbing my arm, Tate swiftly led me out of the mall as people glanced up at us, literally stopping in their tracks. Almost everyone had their gazes on Tate, and I didn't mind it, but when I saw the girls ogling over him, I narrowed my eyes at them, tightening my grip on Tate just in case. Walking out into the cool wind had me shivering, and I inched closer to Tate as he grabbed me by the waist and kept me close as he guided the way. We walked towards the parking lot and towards a large, masculine-looking car. I raised my eyebrows in amusement as Tate held the passenger door open for me. "A gentleman, are we?" I said with a grin as I slipped into the car, and only a second later Tate appeared on the other side. "Starting the engine, of course," he said with a grin, and my gaze fell onto his lips. His plump, pale lips, oh my, hesitantly. I leaned over and grabbed the collar of his shirt. Tate looked at me in confusion, and before I backed out, I pulled him towards me and crashed my lips against his. Tate froze for only half a second until he got the hint. He grabbed me by the waist and pulled me to his side of the car, which had me on his lap. My hands slipped into his hair and I tugged at it to bring him closer to me. Tate growled and I moved back slightly, only to have him crash me against him and have him place his lips back on mine, urgently moving them with my lips. I was slightly startled by the dominance of Tate, but it had butterflies erupting in my stomach, and I giddily cupped his jaw as his arms tightened around my waist. We parted and Tate rested his forehead on mine as he leveled his breathing, his eyes closed. I, on the other hand, panted and was left breathless. "If you don't want to have a car crash by putting images into my mind later on," Tate said in a breath, "I suggest we stop for now," he said with a little growl as he looked at me with dark, lust-filled eyes, making me squirm in. What was it? Desire? Slipping back into my seat, I played with my fingers, but couldn't ignore the tingles that danced around on my lips. I brought up my hand and touched my bottom lip softly. I wasn't falling asleep tonight. Arriving back to the committee in lightning speed, Tate had his arms around my shoulders as we entered the building to be greeted by Tom and Colin nearby. "Alpha Luna," Tom said with a suspicious look as he looked between the two of us, making me grin. Colin gave us a smirk as he motioned his cup towards us with a nod of the head. "Beta," I said to Tom with a wide smile as he rolled his eyes at me. "Colin," I said, returning his nod as he sent me a wink. Tate cleared his throat and pulled me to his side as his arms secured around my waist, leaving tingles. "Alina and I will be in the office," Tate announced as he turned away with me beside him, not waiting for an answer. We walked down various halls and his tall yet familiar office doors came into view. Holding the door open, I slipped in and Tate stayed close behind me as he closed the door behind the both of us. I walked over to the leather sofa next to a bookshelf and took a seat, slumping into it in the process. Tate also took a seat which was right beside me. He put his arms around me, pulling me close as I rested my head on his chest, savoring the warmth. "How'd you know where I was today?" I asked in curiosity as I glanced up at Tate, only to see he was already looked at me. "Eddie," he simply said, and I let out a mental "oh." "Well," I said into the silence as I sat up straighter and faced Tate completely. "You know," I said as I let a smirk slip onto my face, "you scared those guys back there." I said as I looked at Tate with an eyebrow raised. Good, I'm glad I did. Tate mumbled, his gaze on my lips, and I couldn't help but smile. Tate, I said with a gasp, making his eyes snap to mine. Do you realize how rude that is? I said with a glare, but I failed to keep it on as I struggled to stop the smile from slipping onto my face. What can I say? I'm a possessive guy. Tate said, smirking as he leaned in closer, his breath fanning my cheek. So you're saying? I said, pursing my lips more like admitting, that you were jealous. I said, and the idea of him being jealous of me made me melt from the inside. Yes, wouldn't you have been? Tate asked, amused, as he leaned his head down, placing a kiss onto my neck, making me shudder. No. I scoffed, but even to my ears it sounded false, and I felt Tate's smirk against my skin. Don't worry. Tate said, his eyes darkening as his dark hair slightly fell over his hazel eyes. Everyone will know you're mine. And with that being said, Tate placed another gentle kiss on my neck, and I felt sharp teeth bite into my neck. And then I was marked crush. Tate moved back from my neck, and I looked at him in shock. Did he just mark me? I felt my wolf stir in delight, and I looked into Tate's eyes and gasped as I felt an incredible pull towards him. Looking at him, I found him 100 times more attractive, and I felt beyond weird. What's happening? I asked in confusion as Tate wrapped his arms around me, making electric sparks dance on my skin. The mark just made the bond a little stronger. He said in a whisper, and his hazel eyes looked at me with a deeper emotion than usual. A little, I mumbled, and Tate chuckled. The sound music to my ears may be a lot. He said with a grin and leaned down, placing a kiss on my new mark, making me shudder in delight. That brought me back to my first question. Did he just mark me? Did you just mark me? I gasped as I leaned back from his arms to look at him properly. I thought we just established that. He said with a grin as he tilted his head with an amused expression. I know that, I said, rolling my eyes. It was just uncalled for, I said lowly, closing my eyes as Tate placed gentle kisses on my neck. Are you mad? He asked in a husky voice, his breath on my neck as I shook my head. Actually, I said, looking thoughtful. I'm not. I said, and Tate beamed at me as he gave me a breathtaking smile. Just then a knock sounded on the door, and in came Colin and Tom. Tate turned around slightly as he looked at them with an eyebrow raised. Did I say you can come in? Tate asked. His eyes narrowed as Tom looked at us with a guilty expression. Colin, however, just looked at us with a smirk as he waggled his eyebrows. Finally marked her, Colin said smugly as I looked at him in shock. It was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. He said with a grin as he glanced over at Tate, giving him a nod. Right, well, what is it? Tate asked impatiently, and Tom grinned. Tate walked over and they begun talking as I went around the desk and sat on Tate's chair. Leaning back, my eyes scanned over his office and fell onto his phone. Leaning over, I grabbed the phone out of its place and began dialing Lily's number. After only 2 rings, Lily's cheery voice was on the other line. Lily here, said the voice down the phone, and a smile lit up my face. Hey Lily, I said, and there was a pause. Alina. About time you called. She scowled into the phone and I rolled my eyes. Tell me what happened when I left. She gushed, and I glanced at Tate, smiling. Nothing. He just got a little angry, but everything's fine. I said, my eyes not leaving Tate, and as if he felt my gaze. He turned his head slightly to give me a grin. That's all, Lily said, sounding disappointed. How is Tate anyway? Lily asked, and my mouth fell open. Tate. I repeated, sounding shocked, and at the mention of his name Tate glanced over along with Colin and Tom. Girls mentioning your name over the phone, Tom said, looking at Tate. Not a good sign, he said, shaking his head, and I shot him a glare. On first name basis are we? I said to Lily, feeling a little angry but kept my voice down nevertheless. Why not? Lily said back, her voice coming across harsh, and my brows scrunched in confusion. Oh, sorry, Lily said sarcastically, and I was starting to get angry. Only you have that privilege, she hissed. My mouth fell open and I glanced at the phone in disbelief. Was this Lily talking? What is your problem? I asked, however, was greeted by an ended call. I sat back in Tate's chair, confused and flustered. The only reason I can come up with for Lily's behavior was that she was crushing on Tate. Anger flooded my veins and I tightened my grip on the phone. Any tighter and it might break. Tate said, and my head shot up to see that it was only him and I in the room as he stood there watching me carefully. Care to explain? He asked as he leaned on the desk right in front of me. I think I said, glancing at the phone. Lily might have the hots for you, I grumbled. It was silent for a few moments and I looked up at Tate only to see he had a grin on his face. Jealous are we? He asked with a low chuckle, and I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. When I think about, I don't blame her. Tate was an insanely attractive man and his good looks did him no justice. I'm not jealous, I said in a defensive tone, and Tate just grinned as he scooped me off of his seat and placed me on his lap as he took my previous spot. Truth be told, I was a little jealous. But mostly I was angry. Angry that my best friend would even consider liking my mate. Alina, Tate said softly. It wouldn't matter if the entire female population liked me, he said, brushing his lips against mine softly. I only have eyes for you. At his sweet words, I melted in his arms. My wolf reached out to his and I closed my eyes as I melted into Tate. But admit it, you were jealous, the cocky side of Tate said. I shot back and looked at him in disbelief. Way to ruin the moment, you sound so sure, I said, narrowing my eyes at him. Tate placed his hands on my waist and leaned in, a smile playing on his lips. That's because I am, he said in a whisper and leaned down further to steal a kiss. The door slammed open and I shot up in my seat, my head snapping to the door. Eddie stood there with mud painting his knees as he wore a triumph smile. Noticing the position Tate and I were in, Eddie's smile slowly disappeared. Gross, Eddie yelled in disgust, and Tate chuckled while I climbed off Tate. It was gross, I said with an equal tone of disgust, which made Eddie look at me in curiosity and Tate look at me with an eyebrow raised. He wouldn't let me go, I said sadly and mentally smirked at my acting skills. What? Eddie gasped as he shot his older brother a glare. The little 8-year-old ran up to me and hugged my waist while I patted his back. I did I? Tate mumbled in amusement, shaking his head. Brother. Lily sat across me, swirling her straw, making patterns in her beverage. I had dialed her back after she so rudely hung up on me. I was willing to clear the tension between us if she was. We were in the kitchen inside the committee building and it felt as if I were the one visiting. It was that uncomfortable look. I know you're annoyed with me. I just want to know why, I said, and a hint of irritation seeped into my voice, and Lily looked up at me with an eyebrow raised. You really can't tell you have everything, she said, clenching her jaw, and I looked at her in puzzlement. First they choose you for a scholarship. The alpha turns out to be your mate. All this drama happens, and to top it off, you're an elemental. Lily said, her eyes burning in what I now can describe as jealousy. Are you jealous? I gasped and looked at her in so much confusion. Lily seemed to take my comment the wrong way because she stood up and let the kitchen stool fall to the ground. I also stood up and my fists clenched. She is, or maybe was, my best friend, but she didn't have the right to treat me like this for no reason. Jealous? Lily screeched in disbelief, and I flinched from the sound. Did I do something wrong? I am anything from jealous. She spat and I opened up my mouth to speak, but a sound from the doorway made our heads snap into the direction of the noise. Really, from here it sure looks like it, Colin said, his usual glass in hand, as he swayed into the kitchen. Tom followed closely behind and he glared at Lily. We'd appreciate it if you treat our Luna with respect, Tom said with hard eyes at Lily, narrowed her eyes at him. And who's this, your guard dog? She seethed and was shaking from rage as her eyes built up in frustrated tears. She did not just go there, Lily, I gasped as Tom looked genuinely offended and his eyes turned into slits as he took a threatening step forward. Tom growled and looked at Lily in hate, and I quickly turned around to face Lily. You need to leave, I said as even Colin began frowning. Lily was not herself and I didn't know who this person was. Lily glared at all three of us and ran for the exit. I didn't make a move to stop her and I clenched my jaw tightly, making my teeth hurt from the brutal force of it. That was Lily, you know, your best friend. Could have fooled me, Colin said with a chuckle, and I shot him a glare, making him grin. No, I said gruffly, I don't know who that person was, I said with my eyebrows furrowed as I slumped into the nearest seat. You know, Tom said thoughtfully, Alpha could have her head for that. he said and looked thoughtful for a moment as if he were considering it. But he won't, I said firmly, sure. She was acting like a class A bitch. But it didn't mean I wanted her dead. Maybe only a tiny bit of me that was just a little possessive over Tate. Stop it, Alina, I scowled mentally. Why are you guys here anyway, eavesdropping? I said, sending them a glare, and Colin rolled his eyes. Actually no. Alpha's older brother, as in my other nephew, is visiting, and Alpha told us to make sure he doesn't. Colin paused as he tilted his cup back. Swallowing the substance annoy you, brother? I said, dumbfounded. Tate has an older brother. He never told me. I said, tilting my head to the side as I peered at them expectantly, waiting for an answer. Well, they aren't exactly on the best of terms. Tom cut in and sent Colin a look. Colin looked at him and raised his hands in a surrender motion. Don't, I said, glaring at Tom. Let him tell me. I said, sounding more nosy than I should have, making Colin smirk. As their beloved uncle, my lips are sealed, Colin said with a sly grin as Tom shrugged his shoulders. Just ask Tate, I'm sure he'll explain. Tom said as he gave me a small smile. I just nodded it and turned around to leave. I made my way to Tate's office. My brain automatically knew the route and my feet moved like they were possessed. Not bothering to knock, I pushed open the door and stepped in with my eyes onto the floor. Hey Tate, I heard. Looking up, I froze with my hand on the door handle as I looked at the scene in front of me with wide eyes. Tate stood with a murderous look as he had his hands wrapped around a stranger's neck. The stranger smirked at him, which made Tate growl. His father Roger stood on the other side with a scowl on his face, while Eddie stood giggling, which made Tate shoot him a glare, silencing him. Everyone's gaze found mine, and I stood there frozen, gaping like a fish out of water. Letting out a nervous laugh, I scratched the back of my neck. I'm sorry, did I interrupt a family reunion? Annoyance. I stood there awkwardly as my words lingered in the air like a bad stench floating in the atmosphere. The scene in front of me was not what I expected, and I couldn't help but think what a great photo moment this was. My words, however, seemed as if they didn't reach Tate's ears, seeing as his hands tightened around the stranger's neck. The stranger, who I now assume as his brother, was having trouble obtaining his smirk, but never let the mocking look on his face disappear. Dale, that's enough, Roger said in a gruff tone, to the person whom I now know as Dale. Roger shot Tate a look, and Tate clenched his jaw as he let go of Dale. Tate's eyes snapped to mine, and I gave him a nervous smile. Oh my, didn't I just have to walk into a happy family reunion? I thought dryly as Tate appeared in front of me, his face close to mine, blocking my view of Dale. Is everything all right? He asked me in a soft tone as his lips brushed against my forehead. Shouldn't I be the one asking that? I asked and couldn't help the grin that spread upon my lips. Tate opened his mouth to speak, but Dale made a noise that resembled a gasp, which made Tate's head snap to his. Tate, he said in disbelief. You didn't tell me you had a lady friend. Dale said with a wide smile as he walked towards Tate and I. Aren't you a sight to look at? Dale said with a smirk, and Tate growled lowly as he turned around to lash out, but I held his arm. I smiled sweetly at Dale. Too bad I can't say the same thing, I said, and rolled my eyes as I glanced at a snickering Eddie in the far corner. A mouthy one, are we? Dale said with an eyebrow raised, and Tate gave him a death stare. Don't speak to her, he said lowly. In fact, don't look at her, Tate said, looking back at me as he pulled me into his arms. I heard Roger sigh and walk over towards the door with Eddie right behind him. You'd think Eddie would be the immature brother, he mumbled as he looked at his younger son with a small smile. Eddie, on the other hand, puffed out his little chest and stuck out his tongue towards Dale and Tate. You call that mature? Dale said with a snort. It was nice seeing you, Alina, Roger said, ignoring his son's comment as he opened the door to leave. You too, Roger, I said with a warm smile as Dale let out a low whistle. First name basis with the big man, Dale said in disbelief as he looked at his father in confusion. Tate sighed impatiently and his arms around me tightened. The Luna can speak as she wishes, Tate said in a voice like stone as Roger stepped out hurriedly with Eddie behind him. Most likely wanting to avoid further conflict. Luna, so she isn't a play toy, Dale said thoughtfully as he gave Tate a pat on the back, making Tate growl. Play toy, I couldn't help but ask as I glanced at Dale and looked back up at Tate. Why would you think that? I said as an image of Tate and some random blonde bimbo popped up into my head. Well, you see Tate over here, Dale, get out. Tate said in a hard tone, his entire body shaking as he glared at his older brother. He seemed to hate his presence, and Dale was taking advantage of that. Always so grumpy, Dale mumbled as he slowly walked towards the door. You are anything but cheerful. You sure as hell don't live up to your name, Dale said, referring to the meaning of Tate's name from what I understood. I couldn't help but mentally snort at the idea. Sure, Tate has his happy days, but cheerful. That's going over the top. Because Dale is such an appealing name, Tate said, tilting his head to the side with a mocking tone. I don't think so, get out, Tate repeated with dark eyes as Dale rolled his eyes. Yes, Alpha, Dale replied with a smirk, empathizing the word alpha. Tate let go off me and was ready to lunge at Dale, but Dale quickly exited the room, slamming the door behind him before Tate could grab a hold of him. Wow, I said, looking at Tate with wide eyes. You and your brother sure as hell share a lovely bond, I said, snickering as Tate ran his hand across his hair. Sighing, oh right, serious moment. Coughing, I tucked my hair behind my ear as I walked to stand in front of Tate. I circled my arms around his neck and looked up at him in concern. Okay, seriously, what was that all about? I asked, but Tate didn't look at me and his body was still tense along with his jaw. I cupped his face into my hands and rubbed soothing circles on his cheekbones, which made him finally look at me. For a second, I forgot what I was saying as I peered into his hazel orbs. The mate bond never failed to amaze me, and the beauty of Tate was surely illegal. It's nothing, it's in the past, Tate said, shrugging his shoulders, but I gave him a flat look which made him sigh and continue. He was supposed to be alpha but refused to have that kind of responsibility. I stepped in, and for 2 years I've been alpha. Dale complained about still being young at the time, but Tate paused as if to create suspense, and I nodded my head, urging him on. Although it was pretty ironic how Dale complained about being too young to become alpha when Tate stepped in being younger than Dale. Now he shows up and says he's ready to accept the alpha title. Can he do that? I said with my eyebrows furrowed as I tilted my head to gaze up at Tate. He chuckled and shook his head. Leaning down, he placed a soft kiss onto my lips. No, he can't. That's why he's doing his best to annoy me, Tate said with a smile now as he cupped my cheek, bringing my face to his stealing another kiss. Leaning back, I smirked and looked at Tate with mischief. Why don't we return the favor? I asked, tilting my head to the side as I smirked. You mean annoy him? Tate asked a little cautiously at the look on my face. Just leave it to me, I said with a wide smile. I placed a quick kiss onto Tate's cheek that had a little stubble on it. Annoyance is one of my many talents, I said in a sing-song voice as I skipped out of the room, leaving Tate to stand there confused. Worse, I chewed onto the piece of meat in my mouth so slowly it was almost painful. I glanced up at Tate, who glared at Dale, who made loud slurping noises while eating his spaghetti. We were having a family dinner, which Roger had demanded we had to have a chance to get along. Although even if it was Roger's request, he was out of sight, which left Tate, Dale, Eddie and Tate ate in silence. While Dale made noses purposely and Eddie kept glancing at me amused. Awkward, that was how I described this. Hey Tate, can you pass me the salt? Dale asked, looking at Tate. But he just clenched his jaw, ignoring his brother. Never mind, Dale said with a dramatic sigh. He leaned over Tate while picking up the salt and spun the lid open. I watched confused as he tilted it over, letting the salt pour all over Tate's food. Tate growled and slammed his fists onto the table, making me jump, while Dale dropped the empty salt jar in fake shock. It just slipped out of my hand, Dale said, backing away from Tate, who had shot up in his seat, ready to attack Dale. What are you, 5? Tate hissed as his hazel eyes burned in anger. As attractive as he looked, I let out a low whistle. Dale, is it all right if you fetch me a cup of water? I asked sweetly as I gave him my best smile. He looked at me and tilted his head. Tate's head snapped to mine and he began shaking. Alina, what are you doing? He said lowly. What? I said innocently, my throat's really dry. I said, gulping as if to prove my point. Eddie giggled at Tate while Dale grinned in triumph. Anything for my sweet Luna. Dale said, smirking at Tate as he sent me a wink, walking over to the sink behind the counter, still giving us a clear view of him. "You little shit, Tate, sit," I said, giving him a hard look. He looked at me with dark eyes but sat down, stabbing his fork into the meat. I glanced at Dale and watched as he got out a cup. He walked over to the tap and flipped it open, putting the cup under it to fill it up. Immediately, I focused onto the tap. I squinted my eyes slightly as I focused my gaze onto the pipe the water came out from. "I think this dinner went really well," Dale said, smiling. Before Dale could speak any further, the tap snapped off and the pipe burst open, making jet-like water smack against Dale, making him yell out in surprise. The water drenched him as he clamped his hands over the pipe, looking the other way to shield his face while water splashed onto him. "What the hell?" Dale yelled as he growled, giving up and covering the pipe as he quickly moved away from it. Eddie burst out into fits of laughter. He clutched his stomach and squeezed his eyes shut as he tried to breathe between his laughter. Tate cracked a smile and looked at Dale in amusement while I hurriedly stood up out of my chair. "Oh my God, are you alright?" I asked in false concern. Dale shot me a look and stood up straight, shrugging his shoulders as the water died down. Yeah," he said with a forced smile. "It's just a little bit of water," he said, glaring at Tate, who smiled widely at him. It was anything but little. It looked as if he had stepped under the shower head and back out. Droplets of water slid off his clothing and smacked the white-tiled floor. "Sorry, brother. I forgot to mention about the poor plumbing here. Must have slipped my mind," Tate said with an easy smile as he shrugged his shoulders, pulling me against him. "It's fine," Dale said, grinding his teeth together. Eyes darkening. "I'm going out to the forest. Let my wolf blow off some steam," Dale said, trying to play it cool, but his eyes held fury as he glared at the tap. "I'm coming too," Eddie yelled out as he trailed behind out an embarrassed Dale. Tate looked over at me and opened his mouth to speak, but I grabbed Tate's arm and dragged him behind me. "What are you? Wait for us," I yelled out as I walked hurriedly to reach up with Dale and Eddie while Tate sighed in defeat and came along. Stepping out, Dale turned his head around to look at us while he walked forward into the woods. I let water trickle out of the soil and created a puddle of water with mud form a few meters in front of Dale as he walked. "I hope none of you ask for a race. I'll win all of you. I'm probably one of the fastest." The smug look on Dale's face vanished as he stepped into the puddle. Looking down, he let out an outraged growl as he clutched his head, tugging onto his hair. "You have got to be kidding me," Dale screamed as he backed away from the mud. "This is so cool," Eddie whispered from near me as he gave me a knowing look. I sent him a wink and looked up at Tate, who was laughing uncontrollably. The noise was angelic and I was dazed for a few seconds. "You are unbelievable," Tate said as his eyes danced in amusement. I was snapped out of it as Dale groaned in annoyance. "God, could this get any worse?" He asked to no one in particular as he rubbed his temple with a frustrated sigh. And just like that, the sprinklers turned on. Tease. Tate had a massive grin on his face as we headed back to his office. I've come to realize this was more of a room to him than his actual one. "Did you see his face? It was priceless," Tate said, his eyes dancing in amusement as he slumped down onto his chair behind his desk. "Can't say he didn't deserve it." I watched with a small smile as he let out a sigh of content as he rested his head back with his eyes closed. I walked over to him with a sly smile. Walking around the back of his chair, I placed my hands onto his shoulders. I put pressure onto his shoulders and rubbed them softly, making a purr-like sound come from Tate. I leaned down to place a kiss onto the side of his neck and his eyes popped open. In speed like I've never seen before, I was on Tate's lap, straddling him as a small growl left his parted lips. "Stop being a tease," he said in a low murmur as his hazel eyes scanned around my face. My grin widened and I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. He immediately kissed back and grabbed my hips to pull me closer. He suddenly pulled back and smiled at me as he tilted his head to look at me. My eyes bore into his hazel ones and I gave him a toothy smile which made him smile too. "Things seem to be looking up," Tate said in a low whisper as his breaths mingled with mine. "About time," I mumbled and closed my eyes as I brought his face to mine once again. "But of course, The moment was short-lived as the wooden doors slammed open, making Tate clench his jaw. "I'm very bored, entertain me, brother," Dale said, strolling into the room. I couldn't help the amused smile that slipped onto my face as I saw he had changed into dry clothes. I climbed out of Tate's lap, which made him growl in disapproval. "Talk about entertainment," Dale said with wide eyes as he gave Tate an 𝐊𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐑𝐞𝐬 smile. "There's this thing," Tate said, tilting his head to the side as Dale looked at him with a smirk. "You probably haven't heard it before, but it's called knocking," Tate said with a sweet smile, making Dale frown while I tried to hide my smile. "I didn't come in here so you can be mean to me," Dale said with narrowed eyes as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Being a little dramatic, aren't you?" I asked Dale as his eyes snapped to mine, a small grin in place. Tate let out a sigh and walked over to me. "Ignore him, it's what I do," Tate said, kissing my lips. "All the time," he said, placing another small kiss on my lips. "Hey, wait, don't ignore me. Want to do something tonight?" Tate said, placing his hands on my hips as he swayed closer to me. "Oh, come on, what do you have in mind?" I said, tilting my head as I purposely bit my lip. "I know you guys can hear me. I have a lot of things in mind," Tate said with no traces of humor as his eyes darkened. I heard Dale sigh and I looked over at him to see him shaking his head, looking down. "Great, it's like live porn," Tate huffed in annoyance and his head snapped to Dale's. "Get out," Tate said, his patience running low as he looked at Dale and then glanced at the door. "Fine, I won't talk," Dale said, lifting his hands in surrender as he walked backwards, bumping into Tate's desk. "Are you sure he's the older sibling?" I asked Tate in a whisper and Dale shot me a dirty look. "I'm not so sure anymore," Tate said, shaking his head as he sat on the sofa, pulling me down with him. Before silence could fall in between us, the phone on Tate's desk blasted into life as it rung loudly. Tate made a move to get up, but Dale quickly leaned over the desk and snatched the phone, bringing it to his ear. I waited for Tate to yell at him or tell him off, but he just ran a hand through his hair and shook his head. "It doesn't matter who I am," Dale said to whoever was on the other line. "You called," he said rudely, and Tate made a move to get the phone, but Dale moved out of his reach. "Yes, I could leave a message," Dale said, amused as he gave a slight pause, listening to the other end. Tate sighed in defeat and sat next to me as an arm circled around my shoulders. "You're no fun at all." "Fine, I'll put Tate on the phone," Dale said, rolling his eyes as he looked at Tate. "It's for you, you don't say," Tate said dryly as he sighed, standing up. "Who is it?" Dale listened to the person on the other line for a second before he looked back up at Tate, looking bored. "Do you know an Adrian?" Shock. "Do you know an Adrian?" As soon as the words left Dale's lips, my head snapped to his. My mouth fell open as I looked at him in shock. Meanwhile, Dale stared at us in wait for an answer. "Did he just say Adrian?" I murmured in a low voice as I shot Tate a look. Tate's eyes were calmly focused on Dale as he slowly walked towards Dale, who held out the phone impatiently. "Surely it couldn't be Adrian. Adrian, hello." Tate grunted into the phone as he looked up at me, his hazel eyes reassuring me. "There has to be at least another 100 Adrians, right?" Tate just stood there for a moment and didn't say anything. I could just imagine the other line listening to his short, steady breaths. Dale and I didn't dare speak as we silently watched Tate. After what felt like hours but were only mere seconds, Tate let out a huff and slammed the phone down onto its receiver. They hung up. He mumbled as he squeezed his eyes shut and ran a hand through his hair, lightly tugging at it. "Who's Adrian?" Dale asked the million-dollar question as his question lingered in the air. "No one bothering to answer, an ex-lover maybe," he chimed in as he looked at Tate with an amused smirk. I rolled my eyes and opened my mouth to speak, but in less than a second he disappeared from my line of vision and my head snapped to the wall where he was pushed up against. "Tate," I gasped. Tate held Dale by the scruff of his neck and had him slammed against the bookshelves lining the walls. "Do you have something to do with this?" Tate hissed through clenched teeth as his eyes darkened dangerously, solemnly focused on his brother. "What are you talking about?" Dale wheezed through the little amount of air he had in his lungs. "I think that's something Adrian would say." Tate growled. Tate looked beyond mad. "If werewolves had heightened temper, imagine an alpha." Tate, "Stop," I said in what I hoped was a firm voice, though. I was successfully ignored. Brother put me down. Dale said, his eyes darkening as he closed his mouth in a thin line, trying to stop the growl from escaping his lips. Brother or not, growling towards an alpha was always counted as disrespectful. Tate made it clear he had no intentions of releasing Dale. Could have been possible Dale might have possibly knew something, but Tate wasn't going to get anywhere with violence. Sighing, I did the only thing I could think of. A little grin played on my lips as I glanced over to the small vase hiding in the corner of the room. Lifting up my palm, I motioned towards it and moved my hand over to where Tate and Dale stood. The water mimicked my motions, and in a second Tate and Dale were sprayed with water. Alina, Tate immediately growled as he turned around and appeared in front of me. In less than a second his eyes were pitch black and he was breathing forcefully through his nose. I took a hesitant step back seeing this. Tate huffed and covered his face with a sigh. Looking back up, his eyes were back to their usual shade of a lovely hazel. He looked beyond irritated and tired. I felt bad. I thought you needed a little refreshment. I mumbled almost guiltily. I risked a glance at Tate, who didn't answer me and just grabbed my waist and slammed me into his chest, holding me in a tight embrace. Would someone tell me what's going on? Dale asked in horror as he looked at me, the vase and back at me. Long story short, Adrian is a crazy psycho and tried to burn this place. Done with his elemental and tried to burn us alive. That psycho turned out to be Duncan, I said in a nonchalant voice, as if I were talking about the weather. Duncan as in our beta Duncan? Dale asked in shock as he looked between the two of us. Either he genuinely has nothing to do with it or he was a really good actor. He's dead, Tate gruffly said. Though that phone call just made this a whole lot harder. Dale nodded slowly as he slowly comprehended this. Wait, you said elemental? Dale said in awe. You mean those things actually exist? Dale asked in shock. I scoffed, offended. I glared at Dale as a grin played on Tate's lips. They aren't things, and yes, we exist. I snapped as I narrowed my eyes at Dale. Dale opened his mouth to speak, but paused to look at me for a moment. Holy crap, you're an elemental? Dale asked again with shock lacing his tone. I just simply nodded my head. That is fantastic. I mean, wait a minute, Dale said with narrowed eyes. You aren't a water elemental, right? Actually, she is. Tate said with a lazy grin as the realization flashed in Dale's eyes. You mean that pipe, the puddle, those sprinklers? Dale gasped in accusation. My eyes widened as I tried to think of an excuse, before I blurted out some lie. Tate slung his arm around my shoulder and cleared his throat, drawing attention to him. That doesn't matter. Go call Colin and Tom, but now. Dale let out a string of fancy words as he walked out of the office, slamming the door behind himself. Tate walked behind his desk and slumped down onto his chair. He looked directly at me and gave me a small sexy grin. I looked right back at him and sent him a wink, which he raised his eyebrows in surprise too. Before our little game can continue, the door was slammed open and Colin walked in with his usual glass of alcohol, with Tom and Dale following closely behind. Tom stood by the door frame, leaning onto it with his arms crossed. Colin, however, strolled in and slammed his glass onto Tate's desk, making the liquid jump up and slightly spill. Whose ass do we have to kick now? Madness. Tate gave Colin a flat look while I laughed hysterically, making Tate's look soften. Tom chuckled and took a seat next to Colin, mumbling, I'll drink to that. So what's the plan? Dale asked, to no one in particular, as he also took a seat, slapping his hands to his knees. Simple. Colin shrugged. Alina starts going to classes and sees if something seems off. Tom and Dale get the warrior wolves in check, and Tate, you try to trace that call. Oh, and I'll be here with my dear friend Jack Daniels. Colin smirked as he patted his glass, which was almost empty. Uncle, you can help me trace the call and ask around. Tate grunted, in no mood to joke around. I let out an uneasy sigh and swiftly glanced around to everyone. Maybe it's not even Adrian, I chimed in. There has got to be at least hundreds of Adrians. For all we knew, it could be a false alarm. Adrian had his neck snapped, and it's not like he could have resurrected. Hell, it's not as if he was Jesus. We should go through with the plan. Our Luna's safety is one of our top priorities. I tried my best to mask my surprise. I was a little shocked that it was Dale who had said it with a serious expression. Something I wasn't used to. He's right. Tate said, looking me in the eye surprisingly. Tate gave the men in the room a small nod. Everyone left the office and went to their duties, though Colin remained in his seat finishing the last drop of his beverage. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Colin mumbled, switching from tipsy to sober in less than a second. Tate ran a hand through his hair and grimaced as he glanced at his uncle. "You and me both, uncle," he sighed, "you and me both." After asking Tate what today's lesson was scheduled to, I took off and made my way to the far left wing of the building. It was going to take some getting used to. The building was so huge. I was used to the more isolated part where Tate and the others stayed. And my room too. That definitely needs some getting used to. I was used to the old cramped-up dorm I used to share with Lily. The sudden change still didn't feel right. Appearing in front of my class, I abruptly stopped as I peered inside and my mouth fell open. No way did I want to walk in there. The madness of what was in front of my eyes reminded me of a scene from High School Musical. Madness, I tell you. Teenagers were scattered around the classroom. Some sitting on tables, some sitting on the desk, and some making out on the wall. All right then. Papers were being thrown around and scrunched up as the teenagers used their wolf strength to add impact. Boys showed off their biceps to girls who giggled uncontrollably. Definitely not Zac Efron material. And who would have thought werewolves would be so human? Holding my breath, I pressed my hand to the door and slowly walked in. It seemed as if time froze. Everyone's chatter died down and several heads snapped to mine. I've never seen this specific crowd of people, and I gave a small smile. And just like that, they lost interest. It was evident they didn't know of my status, and for that I felt grateful. They just flipped you off in a polite manner. My wolf whispered, and I rolled my eyes. Walking further into the room, I found an empty table in the far corner beside the window. Perfect. Placing myself in a seat, I glanced around trying to find something odd. Or perhaps someone odd. Surely Adrian had a few spies here and there. He did last time. "Can I ask you a question?" I nearly jumped out of my seat at the sudden voice. Turning around, I was face to face with a boy who had fiery red hair and his face was covered in freckles. Sure," I asked as I glanced around the classroom, and then my eyes found his. "Could you get cornered in a round room, excuse me?" I asked, flabbergasted as I look at him in complete and utter confusion. I said. The boy paused, as if he were speaking to a 5-year-old. "Could you get cornered in a round room?" The boy repeated, giving me a "Are you deaf?" look. "No." The boy merely frowned but nodded his head thoughtfully. "Chem." I gave him a tight smile and angled away from him. Was everyone here that weird? My answer was yes. People seemed to be taking advantage of the teacher's absence as they yelled like wild animals and screamed bloody murder. Well, technically, I thought to myself, amused. They are wild animals. Before I could get carried away in my thoughts, the door was slammed open and in walked in a big man. I was pretty sure he was the teacher, considering everyone immediately stopped talking and raced to their seats. I eyed the teacher closely, but couldn't quite see his face as he was angled away from me. I had a bad history of psycho teachers, so I wasn't taking any risks. When the class completely settled down, the teacher stood up straight and scanned the classroom. "Right, you bunch of wild dogs. Today we're..." The teacher stopped mid-sentence and he froze as his eyes fell on mine. The students immediately turned around with curious eyes to see what had the teacher to stop mid-sentence. Took me a second to recognize him. My mouth went dry and I looked at him like a deer caught in headlights. Of course it just had to be. Out of the billions of people on Earth, it had to be him. Out of the millions of teachers on the planet, it had to be the one I insulted once upon a time. Standing right there in front of the classroom was Cannibalism Man. The man I had to sit next to on my to the werewolf committee and the one I told to switch to a diet. Perfect, I thought flatly, just my luck, coward. Karma. That's the only explainable reason I could think of. Why else would someone that I have severely insulted in the past come back? My mission was to look out for something or someone odd. I already made up my mind about this teacher. He definitely goes under the evil category. It was evident in his eyes. Eyes filled with demonic flames begging to be set loose and stab me in my cold, frozen heart. Alright, so I was exaggerating. I didn't see any flames or any evil evident in his eyes. I just saw anger. The teacher was simply staring at me in what I assume is shock, but in a second it switched to anger as his eyes narrowed. I had that effect on people well. If it isn't switched to a diet girl. The teacher said with a smug look, probably trying to humiliate me. The students stared at me and snickered. They didn't even get the joke, but hey. If it was someone else the teacher was picking on, I would have laughed too. Can you blame me? I said with a serious expression. Though I'm glad I told you to switch to a diet. Looks like you've lost a few pounds. Even though I was trying to get back at him. He honestly did look like he lost a few pounds. Maybe I was the cure of ending obesity. Or starting worldwide hunger. The students gasped at my words. A few boys chuckled and a girl at the front coughed hysterically. My God, did she need water? I mean, I had an endless supplement of that. So English was our subject, yes. The teacher mumbled and turned around to write on the board. After that, I stopped listening. My eyes were in slits as I eyed every student. But it was to no avail. The teacher stopped talking and everyone began to chat between themselves. I began to relax and truly thought the phone call was a misunderstanding. My job here is done. Standing up, I made my way to the classroom door and swung it open, getting a few curious glances. I lifted up one foot to take a step out, but the sound of someone clearing their throat made me freeze. Turning around, the teacher looked at me with his arms crossed. Going somewhere? He asked, tapping his foot on the door. The students watched me with hawk eyes. Well, if me walking out of the classroom wasn't a big enough clue, then yes, I am. I didn't like him. When I didn't like someone, I let them know. You can't skip class, the teacher said with cold eyes as he gestured me back to my seat. When I didn't move, he looked at me in disbelief. The alpha doesn't tolerate people not attending class. One call and you're out, he said with a smugness lacing his tone. I looked at him with an eyebrow raised and grinned. Really, you know what? Go ahead, you do that. And please tell me what he says. I called out with a wide grin as I strode away from the classroom. I walked through the halls and made my way to Tate's office. I had memorized the way and knew it like the back of my hand. Peering in front of Tate's door, I knocked softly and walked in. Tate had several papers in his hands and his hair was messy as ever. He looked up and his hazel eyes caught mine. Alina, he said with a smile, come here. I smiled back at Tate and walked right into his arms as he held them open for me. How's everything going? I asked in a whisper as I rested my head onto his chest. Arms wrapped securely around my body. Could be better. Tate replied and placed a small kiss onto my head. Did you find anything? Tate asked, pulling back so he can look at my face. I smiled softly and shook my head. No way was I mentioning my past insults with a middle-aged man. Tate simply nodded and let me go as he took a seat. If you can't tell, I'm pretty stressed out, Tate said with a small chuckle. He looked at me with tired eyes and I felt my heart crack. He was my mate, I was supposed to comfort him, I know, I said in a small voice. Looking at the ground, I began thinking for a moment. And then an idea hit me. Hey, you know what we should do? I said with a wide smile. What should we do, Alina? Tate said in an exaggerated tone as he crossed his arms, leaning back in his seat. Look up at my standing from. We should go for a run, I said in a whisper as I skipped forward. Come on. I cheered as I grabbed his hands and pulled him forward. Tate rolled his eyes, but gave me a small grin as he followed me out of his office. I ran with incredible speed as the wind hit my stale blue fur, making me yip happily. My paws didn't sink into any snow, and that was a downfall. Winter was gone and snow had melted away. Tate's wolf trailed behind me almost protectively. I glanced back and rolled my eyes. But if I thought Tate himself was the most beautiful creature in this world, then so was his wolf. Black, his wolf was pitch black. Tate's wolf was one of the biggest wolves I've ever seen. His fur was shiny and almost looked like silk. I had to admit, his black wolf went well with my slightly navy-looking one. We ran for a while and we definitely needed it. With the whole Adrian thing going on, a run was exactly what we needed. Tate nodded his head towards a tree and I nodded my head. Running towards the tree, I stood behind it and shifted back. Quickly getting dressed, I let out a sigh of total and utter bliss. We definitely needed that, I said to Tate as he appeared back in human form with just his dark jeans on. Where's your top? I asked a little nervously. Of course, he had a lean, muscular chest and torso. Torn apart, Tate said with a grunt. Are we heading back? He asked, nodding towards the werewolf committee, and I nodded my head. Tate put his arm around my shoulders and pushed me into the side of his body. I tried not to gasp as tingles danced around my body when I touched his bare body. I think I forgot how to breathe. 𝐿𝐸 breathe. The heat that radiated of his body gave me a shiver, and I unconsciously pressed myself closer to him. Did you hear that? Tate said in a dangerously low voice as he abruptly stopped. I was pushed behind his back and I looked around confused. I didn't hear anything. Growling, Tate strode forward with me closely behind him. He paused for a second and then his tense body relaxed. Someone was around here, but now they're gone. Tate mumbled as he crushed me into his chest, breathing deeply. Looking behind Tate, something caught my eye. What looked like paper was hanging of a branch. Moving away from Tate, I walked over to it. 𝐿𝐸, you're going the wrong way, Tate said, sounding confused. I grabbed the paper and skimmed through the writing. Meet me here tomorrow morning, I read out. Tate snatched the paper and he too read it. Growling, he scrunched it up and threw it to the ground. He's a coward, Tate hissed, leaving notes around. I grabbed Tate's hand and gave him a soft smile. Let's go. We began walking back to the committee in silence. Whoever wanted to meet up tomorrow had an angry elemental coming their way. Great. I squeezed my eyes tightly as I felt the last strings of sleep slowly vanish. I slowly opened my eyes to be greeted by light. My God, I groaned, who the hell created light? I mumbled as I climbed out of bed. I stomped over to the curtains and pulled them shut with brutal force. I definitely woke up on the wrong side of the bed. With slug-like movements, I all but dragged myself to the en suite. I got undressed while groaning, my body begging me to go back to bed. After a short shower, I wore on a pair of faded jeans and one of my favorite hoods. Running my hand over my tangled hair, I sighed and decided to tie it up. Slipping on my tennis shoes, I walked towards the door and put my hand on the knob, ready to open it. I froze for a second and glanced at my bed. My comfortable, warm, fuzzy little bed. Not being able to help myself, I all but sprinted to my bed and leaped off the ground, landing on the soft material. I sighed in content and closed my eyes as I lay on my back. I feel like I'm forgetting something. My eyes popped open and I racked my memory to see what it was I was forgetting. It felt as if a bucket of ice water was thrown at me. Suddenly, what I was forgetting popped up into my mind and I gasped at the realization. We were going to meet up with Adrian. I ran for the door and threw it open. Running down the hallways, I headed towards Tate's office and banged on the door loudly. Tate, I yelled. When no answer came, I rolled my eyes and pushed the door open. Stumbling in, I looked around the room and abruptly stopped as I glanced around the area. No one was in sight. Tate wasn't in his usual spot and papers were neatly stacked on his desk. Untouched, my mouth was open, ready to yell his name. But when no one was in sight, I shut my mouth and stood up straight. I narrowed my eyes as I glanced at the clock hanging up on the wall. Tate, I sneered as my eyes didn't leave the clock. You better not have left without me. With a little growl, I spun around and raced out of Tate's office and the building itself. I saw the forest in the distance and pushed myself further, the green trees passing me in a blur. I followed the route from yesterday and saw the familiar tall trees and made out hushed voices. Much to my dismay, I spotted Tate and Colin talking to one another, while Dale and Tom glanced around the area repeatedly. Alpha, you say it's a trap, yet we are here, Tom exclaimed, and my steps slowed as I neared. Yes, I did, but I'm not going to sit and wait around for him to make his move. Tate replied in a voice like stone. Maybe the note was left for someone else. Dale mumbled, leaning on a tree as he huffed, looking bored. Everyone decided to ignore him and stay put in silence. I fumed in rage and stomped forward towards them, and that made all their heads snap to mine. If it isn't our favorite bundle of joy. Colin cheered as he gave me a huge grin. I ignored Colin and marched up to Tate. I was in no mood for fun and games. 𝐿𝐸, what are you doing here? Tate said through gritted teeth. I looked at him through narrow eyes and faced him. Feeling equally mad, I could ask you the same thing, I said, crossing my arms over my chest as I looked at him with a frown. It's dangerous here. Tate growled lowly as he grabbed my arm. Go back now, he said, gently shoving me backwards. No. I bellowed in anger. He expected me to leave. Who was the elemental here? If anything, I should be telling him to leave. Tate, however, didn't like my answer. He growled loudly in an inhuman way. I jumped back in fright. Before Tate could open his mouth, Colin jumped in and placed a hand on Tate's shoulder. Calm down, big boy. If she wants to stay, she can stay, Colin said with a shrug. Tate snapped his head to Colin's and shrugged his uncle's arm off. So she could get hurt, put in danger. Of all people, you should know how I feel. Tate said the last part in a low voice as he stared at his uncle. I knew what he was referring to. Colin's wife had been killed because she wasn't put out of danger's way. No, Colin, don't listen to him, stay strong. Alina, I think you should go back to the committee, Colin mumbled quietly. I opened my mouth to protest, but Tom nodded his head in agreement. I think you should too, Tom said as politely as he could as he looked at me like I was about to explode. He wasn't too far off. Dale, take your Luna back, Tate commanded, avoiding eye contact with me. What? Dale gasped, pointing to himself. And miss all the action, no way. He scowled like a child as he crossed his arms. Then it's settled, I said smugly as I looked at Dale with a wide smile. Dale, Tate growled in warning. Alpha, Tom said suddenly as he pushed himself off of the tree and stood up straight. I think it might be a little too late for that, he said in an uneasy tone, hearing steps approaching. My gaze followed everyone else's. A lone figure strode out from the trees and towards us. Tate pushed me behind him, and in all honesty, I didn't mind hiding behind his back. So I was a little afraid. So what? Would you look at that, said a male voice, in humor as the figure approached us. Oh no. Why did that voice sound familiar? It's a full house over here, the person cheered. Too bad I came alone. The silhouette finally stood before us and my jaw dropped open so widely. I wouldn't be surprised if it fell onto the floor. Are you kidding me? Tom mumbled as he looked at the boy in irritation. Wait, who's this again? Dale asked as he looked at us with an eyebrow raised. This, I said dryly, is Ryan the fire elemental. I thought he was dead, Dale said in confusion as he glanced at Ryan and back to me. So did we, Dale, so did we. Why aren't you dead? Tate said gruffly as he tightened his hold on me and held me close to his side. Ryan laughed loudly and lifted his hand, letting flames spark at the tip of his fingers. I guess death wasn't ready for me just yet, Ryan said with a large smile. Allow me to explain, he said with a grin as he leaned on a tree playing with the fire on his fingertips. Great, I muttered. Story time.